All right, so this is chapter 4 of the Ethics Code, where we're going to be looking at standards for resolving ethical issues. Okay, so now we're going to take a look at some of the standards up close and personal. And the first one is 1.01, misuse of psychologists' work. Now, this standard is saying that if psychologists learn of misuse or misrepresentation of their work, they should take reasonable steps to correct or minimize the misuse of misrepresentation. Key term in this statement is reasonable steps. Excuse me. APA knows that despite our best efforts, there are going to be some times when, as a psychologist, we might not really be in the best position to make sure that everything is being followed in the correct manner. So an example that was given in Fisher's book is talking about how research psychologists whose work had been misrepresented and they didn't really have access to the listservs, or the group refused to request for a retraction short of a civil suit, then that psychologist would have few corrective options available to them. There is going to be times when uh, there might be a mishap that occurs during your watch. And the only thing it is, you want to try to take every reasonable step to make a corrective action. Be that if you found that, say you did an article, or you might have did a article, or made a statement in terms of it being published, similar to the example, in which you were able to get the, say for example, the monitor. Suppose you inserted an article, you found out that some information that you provided actually wasn't as accurate as you thought it was. When you did a double check, you realized that there was a mistake. In that instance, something like the monitor, you would have to let them know that, okay, I made a mistake. This should be the correct statement. I would like to request for a retraction, please. Same thing holds true if you made a mistake on a report. That's something you have to make clear. And that's really important, not when we're talking about not only research, but speaking in terms of treatment protocols. Suppose you thought you created interventions based off of evidence-based model, but you didn't follow the steps accordingly, and you realize that you missed a very important step. Then you need to make corrective action on that, in terms of informing your client that we need to step back and we need to try it this way because the step was missed. Yeah, sometimes you have to admit to your clients that I made a mistake. We are just human, but you can't just let it slide without trying to do something. That would be a misrepresentation of your level of competence, your abilities to treat, and so forth. So you want to be careful of that. It goes on to talk about how focus on corrective action must be taken when the psychologists learn that others have misused or misrepresented their work. Meaning, if you know I made a mistake, for example, then it's important for you to point out that mistake to me. There will be sometimes, though, when you might not be in that position to be able to provide a correction for the misuse, but you need to try to at least make every reasonable attempt to have a corrective type of actions done based upon that misrepresentation. And if it's where you're not able to, depending on the situation, you might need to take further steps in getting assistance in helping to correct the particular incident or action. But like I said, there are times, like in that example, the listserv is like, we're not going to retract it, we're not going to remove it, it's already posted, it's there for life. Excuse me. So then in that instance, you have to stick with that. But you can make note and annotate that you did attempt to, in case somebody come back and say, hey, Dr. Kearns-Cooper put a mistake inside that and she didn't do anything about it. I can stress and say, well, I did let them know and I did try to correct the action, but they decided to still go with it. that makes you in the clear. Now, standard 1.02, where we're talking about conflicts between ethics and law, regulations, or other governing legal authority. Here we're speaking about if those legal, ethical responsibilities have any kind of conflicts with law, regulations, or governing legal authorities. We have to make sure to clarify the nature of that conflict. We have to be committed to the ethics code and make sure we're taking reasonable steps to resolve whatever that conflict may be, and make sure we're consistent in terms of when we're utilizing the general principles as well as ethical standards of the ethics code. We should not be trying to justify anything if it's bringing harm to others, plain and simple. There's no justification for it. You need to make sure you're trying your best to serve those you're doing work for. All right. So what happens now? What if there's a conflict that happens and we're not able to resolve a conflict? There are going to be times when we can't fix it, maybe because it's an institutional situation, and you're trying to follow the rules of the place you work, but you know that there is a conflict between their job and between the ethics code and you as a psychologist. Well, when there's reasonable actions that do not resolve that conflict, we're permitted to make a conscientious decision to comply with the legal and the regulatory authorities in terms of the actions that cannot be used to justify or defend violating human rights. We're going to be talking about some aspects of that in terms of changes that was made because of the military and the potential of torture that was being pursued based upon psychology working within the military, and they're using practices that was appeared to be violating human rights of those that they were using some unreasonable type practices on. So we'll talk more about that, but that will be one of those examples. Sometimes people have been stuck. However, you need to be trying your best to follow the ethics code at all times. I mentioned to you that I was told to change a report, the place I work, and I refused to change that report. I followed my ethics code. Yes, I was terminated from the job. It can happen. And we can't allow the fear of retaliation to stop us from aspiring and to be doing our best to follow the ethics code. So it's always that balancing slope, it's a slippery slope rather, that you can be on, but first and foremost, you should be trying to maintain those ethical standards. So, Standard 1.02 does not require compliance with law. Keep that in mind as well. Now, again, this was revised back in 2010, and here we're talking about those response reports that kind of involved psychologists, like I was mentioning, in those interrogation type activities, particularly after 9/11, in which it was those type of interrogations was actually harmful to others or deemed harmful to others, and therefore based upon looking at human rights and our main goal of duty, our duty not to harm, and this is where that was established. You can look also within Chapter 4 and read a little bit more with the need to know feature, and that's going to be entitled that 2015 Independent Review relating to APA ethics guidelines, security interrogations, and torture. Then that was that amendment that was included back in 2010, so as well as in 2015. So Also take a look, make sure you take a look at the human rights and psychologists' involvement in terms of assessments that's going to be related to those death penalty cases that you'll find more toward the end of the chapter. But I'm going to keep moving on. All right, now we're continuing on talking about standard 1.02, and we want to make sure that there's true clarification for you in understanding that we as psychologists, we have ethical duties that will supersede our legal obligations when these activities will contribute to any kind of violations of human rights. So when we talk about those interrogations, the law stands now in terms of our ethics code, you are not to do any harm. And if the entities that you may be employed with are trying to force you to, in this case this was the military, you have to rightfully decline as best as you can. Even under those circumstances, you should not be saying, okay, because I work for the military, I have to inflict harm onto others. Your ethical rights code states that that's not the case. You're supposed to say no. In the terms of the example I gave you in regards to me rewriting a report, which would have been unethical, I stood my ground. And yeah, I paid the consequences that they provided, but I stood my ground and followed those ethic codes. And that's what's important. We are not to violate human rights at all. All right. So in terms of psychology and international declarations in terms of human rights, that standard is looking at those critical intersection that's going to be in between ethical responsibility as us as psychologists, as well as looking at how it would influence and impact international human rights movement. There, we have had consistent United Nations declarations on human rights that we try to follow, and that has been included in terms of how we look at the ethics code and how we would handle those different type of situations. So if you're going overseas, you're still expected to follow our ethics code, even if you're not in our country at that time. And we make that declaration. The only thing I'm going to keep repeating, you're going to get tired, like I said, I'm going to sound like, shoo, violate and keep playing. Do no harm. All right, so we're now moving to standard 1.03, and these are conflicts between ethics and organizational demands. And you see how it just sequenced in there? It was a good sequence, and it just followed through, and things that I already spoke about you're going to be seeing again here. But this standard reads, if the demands of an organization with which psychologists are affiliated or for whom they are working conflict with the ethics code, psychologists clarify the nature of the conflict, make known their commitment to the ethics code, and take reasonable steps to resolve the conflict consistent with the general principles and ethical standards of the ethics code. Under no circumstances may this standard be used to justify or defend violations of human rights. Again, in a nutshell. So it's going to sound repetitive, and you see that they're all linked together, but it's kind of in a way to kind of help to remind you what our goal is and how we have to work diligently in order to make sure we resolve any type of conflicts that we may come across. In continuing and speaking about the conflicts, psychologists working in or with organizations may encounter company policies that will conflict with the ethics code. The standard specifically is going to require psychologists to make known their commitment to the ethics code in communications with that organization. Psychologists should not assume that the standard 1.03 will waive their obligation to adhere to other standards within the ethics code. So we're doing this and then we're following this, but we need to make sure that we comply across the board, because you also know that in terms of legality situations that we're supposed to follow the ethics code but make reasonable attempts to ensure and protect our clientele, but there will be times, like if you've been subpoenaed, in which you will have to divulge information, but you have to make every reasonable attempt first to try to avoid divulging too much. All right. Human rights and organizational consulting. Psychologists working in or consulting to organizations must evaluate how their work may unintentionally condone organizational practices that justify violation of human rights. Psychologists working in and consulting to organizations must address the needs of multiple stakeholders who may hold different levels of power or privilege. Several years ago, a place I worked, it was where I was working, and I was responsible. I was a supervisor, and come to find out, some staff that was under me, they had one patient in one unit, and then there was another patient in another unit, and two workers, one from each unit, one from mine, one from the other, heard about, they both had clients that were actually in each of these units. And what happened is they were married. The clients were married. One wanted to get divorced from the other. Now, mind you, they're in a psychiatric institution at this time. Well, the two staff members decided that they were going to work together to help client A, I'll say, get the divorce from client B, who was clearly not capable of signing any documentation based on being actively psychotic. But the staff, who were psychologists, assisted in this process. What kind of ethical conflicts did we have in this scenario, in which two psychologists from different units had two clients married to one another, and one client wanted to get divorced from the other client, and the two of them got together to help client B sign the divorce papers, even though they at this moment was in a psychiatric institution. So, in which, when we're talking about consulting, I want you to consult by all means, but we got to make sure that in our quest we're not overstepping our bounds, and in which case they were. That was not something that they should have been allowed to do. As the supervisor over one of them, it was now my ethical responsibility not only to have the situation brought up to HR, but it was also a situation that I felt had to be reported to the ethics committee, in which I had to do so. So we have to be careful. We can't condone practices of others because they think it's the right thing to do. Oh, we need to help them, this and that. Same holds true with the organization. If the organization itself was doing it, I would still have to make all attempts to rectify the situation based upon the ethics code. So we have to be careful with that. All right. Conflicts between ethics and organizational demands continued. Now we're looking more about commercially funded research. In this piece, you want to be careful about conflicts that might be between any type of organizational demands placed upon you based upon the research you're working on, how it's being disseminated, as well as what findings you have and how it's being published, where it's being published, and so forth. Standard 1.03 do require that we would explain to our sponsors that we have to follow the ethics code first and foremost by best way possible. That would include our commitment to participant protection and the responsibility of maintaining our research to keep it the quality that it should be. All right, so now we're going to start talking about informal resolution of ethical violations. Standard 1.04. When psychologists believe that they may have been an ethical violation by another psychologist, they'll attempt to resolve the issue by bringing it to the attention of the individual, like we talked the last time we discussed the vignettes. And they'll attempt to resolve the issue by bringing it to the attention of that individual. If an informal resolution appears appropriate and the intervention does not violate any confidentiality rights that may be involved. So when we talked about the first case scenario in which the psychologist was told by his client about another psychologist who was a sex worker that they were having sex with therapist in another department. Here, we couldn't break confidentiality, but we still would be able to approach, at least express concern to the therapist, expressing that there has been, suggestion that they might be seeing someone who's actually a client with our facility, and to remind them that this is an ethical violation. And again, you would want to bring up which violations that you feel that they are crossing, and to let them know that you wanted to approach them, so that in hopes to help resolve whatever conflicts is erupting from that. So Standard 1.02, conflicts between ethics and laws, regulations, as well as other governing legal authority. Standard 1.03, conflicts between ethics and organizational demand, is several different things that goes into layers of what I was just discussing in terms of Standard 1.04. How do we start going about resolving those different situations? So in terms of an informal resolution, we could find it to be appropriate where psychologists would be able to look and discuss that violation to the person who is being accused, and to confirm whether there might actually have been any type of misconduct, and then if appropriate, start any type of corrective steps to follow. So say that person, we saw them with a client, we knew that that person was a client, we approached them, expressed to them our concerns, and of course they make denial of it, but we didn't see them again out in public with this client. Now you have to make some corrective actions, being that to kind of help prevent any future violations, you probably will now want to report this to the ethics committee, as you already did an informal process to try to resolve it. It didn't resolve. They were still doing that. So now at this point, you have to take it to the next step. Informal resolutions in interprofessional settings. Now, this is when they're talking about how we're looking at different care settings, like personal care homes, psychiatric facilities, and so forth. Here, psychologists may be approached by other providers seeking assistance for emotional distress or personal problems. We're human, like I said before. There's going to be times when other therapists might get seen or so forth. But we have to still maintain certain standards as we're working, just as if there was a regular client. But these requests, they may raise ethical questions regarding whether it's going to be jeopardizing the welfare of that person who's coming in not as a professional but as a client. One of the things that makes it difficult when you're seeking therapy for yourself is when you know everybody in the area of the state you're in. I've had therapy in the past, and it was where I wound up having to go way outside the box to locate someone to have therapy with, because everybody else at that point in time kind of knew most of the majority of the psychologists in the area. They knew me. Therefore, it wasn't an appropriate place for me to go and have therapy with them. So all attempts was to find someone that didn't know me who could work with me. However, psychologists, they should become familiar with site rules and procedures in terms of reporting any type of impaired practitioners. So if you know that you got a psychologist who is struggling, they might have an addiction, they might be, using drugs, or the list can go on what type of issues they might be demonstrating. And if you know that they're having difficulties and they're not uh, seeking help themselves, but they're bringing their mental health issues into work, then it's our responsibility to make sure that we resolve that conflict as well. We can't kind of, turn the cheek and close our eyes to the situation. We have to make sure that no one is at risk, not that person, nor the clients that they're working with. HIPAA, that fun loving word. Implications of HIPAA in terms of informal resolution. That final rule from 2013 has us stating that we're required as healthcare professionals to make sure we're taking all reasonable steps to mitigate any harmful effects of unlawful disclosure of protected health information by an employee or business associate. So, you remember I just told you a story about the client and the couple? Well, I never said which one initiated which. I never gave the genders. I didn't give you names. I just gave you a scenario and a situation. We're to present often. That's part of our training. And you have to learn how to make sure you're protecting your clients, even in terms of doing presentations. Even years later, when I've discussed these different things, I'm still responsible in maintaining confidentiality about my clients, even years later. But how we do that is extremely important, because we don't want to also be breaking HIPAA. So we have to be careful about that. Okay. Um, Also, it would be helpful if you help other institutions out, which I can get quite annoying with that. Anytime I go to my physician's office, if I see anything wrong and I'm thinking they're breaking HIPAA, I do follow up with that and informally inform them that what they're doing is actually against HIPAA's laws. So they kind of get upset with me more times than not. But example, they shouldn't be yelling the complete name out loud in the doctor's office. I shouldn't hear Teresa Kearns-Cooper. No, they can actually just go by one name. Usually they might say, depending on where, they'll just say a last name, but they won't give the first name, which technically speaking, depending on if you're in a small town or not, that can still be a violation. Uh, when you sign in, a lot of places now, they've gotten smart. They've gotten where you sign in at, once you sign in, the receptionist can remove your name immediately because it's a peel off. But you still have some places that will still have your name in a list where you get to see everybody who's coming in. That's against the HIPAA laws, and that's a violation. Um, One thing I did like Baptists, they've changed over to a computer generated system where you now sign yourself in on like a tablet, so what? And all the information is taken in. It's not done on paper anymore. And you make sure that the screen is erased prior to leaving, so no one knows who you are. That's one way that it could be handled. But we have to at least make sure that uh, in our practices that we are not breaking any HIPAA rules. When an informal resolution is not feasible, there are going to be times when it's not going to be easy for us to say we could come to a resolution. There, some of the examples that's been provided is talking about previous attempts to be able to discuss the violation with an offending psychologist, and we saw it was ineffective. Like I made mention in the example, talking about going to the psychologist whose question to be might be seeing a client, and that accusation, presenting that accusation that was heard, but then actually seeing it for my own eyes, in which I might have been out on town and noticed I saw that therapist with the client that was in question. So at that point, it doesn't make sense for me to go back to the person now. I've already made that attempt to do that. Um, so that informal resolution really might not be the right thing to do anymore because I previously made the attempt. There's other times though you might find yourself had made a couple of attempts in different type of situations. But if you see that you're repeating yourself over and over and that offending psychologist is still doing it, okay, now you need to go ahead and um, take responsibility and make sure that without invading on anyone's confidentiality, go through the proper steps to ensure a more formal type of corrective action. Now, there's a peer review process in terms of like when you do your research, once you're out there in the psychology world on your own and you're doing autonomous work, there's what we call peer reviews in which your manuscript or your grant proposal, it can sometimes have information that's going to be submitted where people might be afraid there is going to be an ethical violation, or let me just say it plain and simple. There was times when people have inadvertently or purposefully plagiarized. So peer reviews often helps to kind of combat that. If it's found that that has occurred, then they will attempt to do an informal resolution in which that reviewer will alert the editor so that they can stop the presses because you don't want that wrong information getting out there. But when it's not appropriate, a more formal complaint may happen in which we want to make sure that all the materials that was utilized, you're going to have your ducks in a row in the attempt of seeing if there's plagiarism for the example that I was using. um, Double checking by actually looking up and finding the uh, proposed information that's been copied or sampled, and utilizing that in the process of informing the editors, uh, allowing them to know. So I always try to push and express the importance because there have been cases of plagiarism in school. You hear about it all the time. But the impact that it can have can be dubious on your careers, um, as well as, I mean, your reputation. So utilizing a peer review helps us to kind of make sure that doesn't happen and doesn't occur. Because sometimes it's accidental. One thing I always tell students now is like Grammarly is a great product to use when you're doing your research and you're writing your second year papers and you're writing your dissertations. I highly recommend going ahead and investing, you know, for how many months you need it for. You can wait until you've gotten it compiled really well, and just you could pay for the 1 month. It's like $39.99, something like that. But what it does is it doesn't only just help you in terms of knowing that you know are grammatically correct, but it also lets you know if it's finding information that's seen elsewhere in other authors' names where you may not have provided credit for. So that's always a good investment for you to have. So in terms of reporting ethical violations, Standard 1.05 is talking about how ethical violations have substantial harm or is likely to substantially harm a person or organization and is not appropriate for informal resolution under Standard 1.04 in terms of informal resolution of ethical violations. Or is not resolved properly in that fashion, psychologists take further action appropriate to the situation. Such action might include a referral to state or national committees or professional ethics, to licensing boards, or to the appropriate institution authorities. So there's always some type of protocol in a lot of different institutions, but if you're finding that someone is in violation, and there's going to be times when it has to be immediate. Immediate in the sense that suppose the person in question, now let's go back to the sex worker. The sex worker approached you and said, I, realized that this therapist has been paying me to have sex with them, and that I want to report this. Well, now this is more direct. This is not an accusation from a third party. This is between the two of those, and this person is wanting to make a complaint. And in which at this point, when I'm not breaking confidentiality, because they're definitely having, this person saying they're definitely having sex, I now have to take it automatically to the next level. And now, because there's more substantial harm that's involved, now I have a direct link. So that makes it different. The standard does not apply when an intervention would violate confidentiality rights or when psychologists have been retained to review the work of another psychologist whose professional conduct would be in question. So, of course, like I mentioned in my little scenario, that person, they was, in terms of wanting to make the report, I would actually help them to make the report. I wouldn't be the one directly reporting their name, but if they were willing to, I would have to get their consent, so to speak. But if I was asked to review that therapist stuff, then my involvement has to change because now it's a conflict with me. So you have to be careful of all of that. As a rule of thumb, behavior is likely to cause substantial harm and therefore requiring formal reporting. Most times than not, it's going to be that sexual misconduct, any kind of insurance fraud, like I said, plagiarism, as well as blatant intentional misrepresentation. Standard 1.06 is when you're talking about when you're going to cooperate with ethics committees. As psychologists, we need to make sure we're cooperating with the ethical investigations, proceedings, as well as resulting requirements from the APA or any affiliated state psychological association in which they belong. So pretty much that's saying that, when we address any of these confidentiality issues, that if we fail to cooperate, is itself going to be an ethical violation. So say you've seen all this, you heard about this, you've been approached, and you do nothing. That's an ethical violation. You have to cooperate. However, making a request for deferment of any type of adjudication of an ethics complaint pending the outcome of litigation does not constitute non-cooperation. Okay, so if you're the one who has been accused, for example, when you are asking for a deferment in order to get more information in regards to what's been thrown at you, it doesn't mean you're not cooperating. But if you're the one who has initiated the complaint, then you should be fully cooperated if you're willing to do so. If you started that process, you have to finish the process, basically. All right, continuing on, in order for us to make sure that there's validity and viability in terms of the adjudication process. We as psychologists, we are required to cooperate in terms of state-affiliated ethics investigations, proceedings, and resulting requirements. So I shouldn't just go, well, just because you'll say it don't mean I got to follow it. I should at least allow the process to work, to go through it. I shouldn't be trying to avoid any of the process at all. I should be involved because, well, how can I say it? Pretty much, say somebody accused me, and I just ignore the whole situation and try not to deal with it. Well, by not cooperating, it's only adding more violations to me because it's not allowing for a full investigation to clarify whether there has been any type of misrepresentations, any misconduct, any conflicts that was detrimental to a client's interest. And because I'm not being, or I'm withholding, I'm not being forthright, then in essence that can be detrimental to someone's mental health. Therefore, that's a new violation that they can put upon you. Requiring cooperation with an ethics committee when a complaint has been filed will not violate your Fifth Amendment rights against self-incrimination because the professional organizations are not bound by that Fifth Amendment, basically. So cooperate is the main thing you need to know. All right. There's going to be times when there's improper complaints that's been ensued. And so standard 1.7 says psychologists do not file or encourage the filing of ethics complaints that are made with reckless disregard or willful ignorance of facts that would disprove the allegation. Now I'm going to use me as the example again. When I talked about having to change the report, and when I didn't do it, well, not only was I terminated, but the person, the supervisor that was over the facility decided that they wanted to put me on the child abuse list and made these type of improper complaints and allegations against me, saying that I basically abandoned a client, which I did not. I was thankfully able to prove that. That's why you should always document, document, document. Keep all your documentation. Even including when you go, for me, I also documented every appointment I had. Not only did I document it in my notes, but I kept a separate journal of what I did throughout the day. Kind of my to-do list, but thankfully because I did that, it was able to coincide to show and demonstrate that I actually did my job. So document, document, document. But also, just in terms of, don't try to retaliate against somebody by placing a false report, so to speak, or start a formal process and you really don't have all your eggs in the basket. You're not sure if everything is, just don't be reckless. Kind of be sure when you go to make that step that this is something that more than likely, once you start the ball rolling, the investigation will prove it to be more than likely true. But if you provide information that actually can be disproven, it's not a good thing. You're going to be looked down upon yourself, and actually the question will now be, was you doing that to be spiteful? Is it something that we need to open up an investigation on you about? So yeah, make sure it's the proper procedures you're following, and it's not just something that you're throwing out there because you can, because some people do that, unfortunately. Common improper complaints to the APA Ethics Committee would be like on academic colleagues. If you got another practice, say you're out there and you have your own practice, and you got another psychologist across the street practicing, and they're taking away your business, so now you're a rivalry, and you decide you want to try to get rid of them. That's not an appropriate way of doing it. Or psychologists, particularly being called in as expert witnesses, and one saying this, and you're going to try to combat that by throwing shade, so to speak. It violated. Psychologists making a complaint had access to any kind of information that would refute that accusation, whether or not it would be available to them, or any type of succeeding type of information. You need to be careful of what you're doing, pretty much. And I know I'm sounding repetitive, but it's important that you know. All right. Unfair discrimination against complainants and respondents. Now, as a student, here's the thing I want to express before I even go into this further. I got to sit up, excuse me, so you can see me good. A lot of times, students have fear of retaliation from their faculty. It's just reality. What I'm saying to you is, if there's any incident in which you feel that a faculty member might be stepping over their bounds, might be violating any of the ethics code, you, even as a student, still need to make sure that you follow the ethics. You're in control of your own abilities, so you want to make sure you're following the ethics code. When we talk about unfair discrimination acts, complainants, and respondents, psychologists do not deny persons of employment, advancement, admissions to academic or other programs, tenure, or promotion based solely upon their having made of their being the subject of an ethics complaint. So God forbid, for some reason, somebody accused you, for example, of plagiarism, and you decide you're going to still apply for a job or whatever, but it gets out. Until such any kind of ruling or anything, I should not be holding it against you, bottom line. Okay? But this does not preclude taking action based upon the outcome of such proceedings or considerations of other appropriate information. While this is still being investigated, I really shouldn't be using it. And if the outcome came out that you were found to be in violation, this is something that I would then have to take in consideration on whether or not, if we use the plagiarism, for example, whether or not you would be able to be successful throughout the rest of your program, because now it's going to come in question on whether you would be still doing that. I, as faculty, would highly recommend remedial type practices to help along through it. It probably would be provided to you anyway, but we wouldn't deny you at that point, but actions can be taken afterwards, pretty much, if you were found to be in violation. But it does state that it prohibits unfair discrimination against those who make ethics complaints. Now I'm going to go back. If you saw that I was doing something wrong, and you felt that I was having an ethical violation to the point where you couldn't do an informal process, but you needed to do a formal process, then I cannot hold that against you, basically. Okay? I cannot discriminate against you because you decided to report me. Would I be upset? Probably. I'm not going to tell you a lie, but that would not mean, because you're in my course right now, that, oh, I'm going to fail them for that. If you're doing the work, I can't fail you because you did the work. If you made a complaint against me, and you wouldn't have to, so to speak. Excuse me, my hair is just irritating me right now. But you wouldn't have to worry about me. You shouldn't have to worry about me retaliating against you, basically. That's a form of discrimination. It also prohibits any kind of unfair discrimination against people who might have been accused of or found to have committed an ethical violation. That shouldn't be my foremost, but I am going to say, based upon depending on what the situation it is, do many people still use the information? Yes, they will. I'm not going to hide that from you, but we should not discriminate. If we find that the issues at hand are so the violations create any due harm, then yeah, it's where, okay, I'm not going to put you back with a client you had sex with. I'm not going to assign you to uh, people if that was one of the issues or problems. So, but we should not um, attempt to discriminate because of that. Everybody deserves a chance, but you have to take that in consideration. And you have to look at the situation at hand. What's the severity? So I'm at the end of chapter 4. Please do continue reading. Um, your exam this week is on the first 4 chapters of the textbook. There will be multiple choice. So please make sure that y'all take care of it in due time that it's due. It will be closing, if I believe I put correctly, for next Monday. So please make sure you get through it this week. And I will talk to y'all again soon.